Our commitment to relationship, it's a basic for most of us in ethical societies. So what do we mean by commitment to relationship, and why is that important? Uh, Last month, I spoke to many of you here who were there last month around our commitment to human worth. And today I want to speak about the commitment to relationship. These are two of the most central commitments, I believe, in ethical culture, and they are interrelated. When I talked about human worth and how we are each unique and precious, I was actually talking about relationship. Because the idea of worth, the idea of being unique, the idea of being precious, all those only make sense in the context of a relationship to another person. We are not isolated individuals. One of the oldest writings in the world, the Rig Veda, talks about what they call the net of the God Indra. They conceptualize this as like a huge fishing net. At each intersection, there is a crystal bead that represents an individual human being. Anne Adams, more recently, has described this net in these more modern poetic words. There is an endless net of threads throughout the universe. At every crossing of the threads, there is an individual, and every individual is a crystal bead. And every crystal bead reflects not only the light from every other crystal in the net, but also every other reflection throughout the entire universe. Well, from the oldest to one of the most basic, we are, at core, life forms, created by a process that has taken billions of years. The first single-celled life first appeared on Earth about 3.5 billion years ago. For more than 2 billion years, single-cell life prevailed. And sometimes these organisms of single cells cooperated with each other by forming clusters or mats, but they were not true multicellular organisms. Each was essentially a hermit, each engaging with the environment separately, surviving and reproducing. Even for a single cell, the two basic characteristics to make a cell healthy were these. The first is differentiation, that is, boundaries that separate the cell from its surroundings, and connection, ways in which the cell can interact with the environment in order to get the energy it needs and to get rid of waste. A healthy cell has to be separate from and connected to the environment. This is the basic fact of life. Separation and connection are not opposites, although we often think of them as opposites. They are interrelated. So what did it take for life to become multicellular? At first, in such simple organisms as algae with maybe a few dozen cells, and maybe later in complex animals like the 35 trillion cells that make up each of us as a person. What did cells need to create the kind of interaction and communication that makes such complexity possible? How did cells move beyond the clusters that shared resource and protection against threats to that complexity? Well, life evolved from single cells to multicellular organisms several different times. Scientists guess at least 25 different times in 6 basic groups. Cells are the very basic unit of life. In multicellular organisms, cells give up some of their independence in order to work together, becoming specialized and diverse, and not being able to survive separately any longer. For cells to function in a multicellular organism, they still need boundaries that differentiate each cell from the other, while at the same time maintaining the ability to connect. Biologists call this semi-permeable boundaries. They also need more ability to communicate with each other in complex ways, to draw on the strengths of other cells that have different specialties, so that together they are all stronger, more resilient than any would be alone. Mammals were among the last of the complex animals to evolve. By the time we came around, with more than 35 trillion cells differentiating and cooperating, like some other forms of life, plant and animal, we also developed ways that the complex organisms themselves could coordinate this dance of interaction, differentiation, and connection. So in addition to within our bodies and these cells coordinating, as different people interacting, we have learned to coordinate how we balance differentiation and connection. And this includes developing those specialized cells that make up a brain, whose activity creates the process that we call mind. We now know from the neuroscience of child development that our minds develop in connection with other minds. Each brain may be in a separate body, but it is the interaction of mind with mind that almost from the moment of birth and maybe before develops that brain into the kind of mind that can listen and speak, read and write, make ethical choices. As I was thinking about this topic, I remembered vividly when my first son was born. We had decided before he was born that if circumstances were right, I would refuse any drugs that might affect the baby and take them only at the last minute. Well, the last minute came, and the doctors misinterpreted some of the signals as meaning that the baby was in distress, which he wasn't. So at that point, there were no pain-reducing drugs for me at all. And when he was born, he was amazingly alert. The nurses kept coming in to tell me how, even on his first day, his eyes were following the movements of people. And his eyes lit up when someone got close enough that he could recognize that it was a person. And his engagement and recognition of them engaged the nurses. I've watched many babies since that week, and I'm always amazed at how much agency babies have and how much impact they have on those they're interacting with. Child psychologists tell us that this interaction of babies with adults is essential. If adults don't engage with baby, the child's development is impacted. Those children who have very little or no real engagement from adults in those first days of life often have lifelong challenges to overcome. It is in those first moments of our lives that we begin to have relationships. And many moms know that there is some relationship before birth as well. The insights of philosophy and religion and the realities of biology and psychology all come together and agree. We are interdependent beings, neither completely merged into a larger undifferentiated whole, nor completely separate and independent. And those amazing brains that developed out of multicellular cooperation, also in animals, including humans, have certain patterns of response that they have built in as a result of those long millennia of evolution. As human beings, we react positively when we have a sense of autonomy. There are actually chemicals in our brain released when we are experiencing things like competency, agency, creativity, integrity, chemicals that make us feel good. We also react positively when we sense that we belong to something bigger than ourselves, that we are supported, that we are respected, when we are able to participate. Each half of that interrelated pair of processes, differentiation and connection, each of them is important. So I'm going to focus today on how we act, not as merely biological reactive beings, but as fully conscious choice-making members of the human family. Because there are clearly some relationships which help people in them thrive, and some relationships which do not help people to thrive. Far beyond the biological basic reality that we are connected and have to deal with that, human beings have had opinions about how to have good relationships as long as we have evidence of human thought. And some of those teachings have been ones that prioritized the well-being of some people over others, or that ignored that others may have different needs than our own. Some of those early teachings recognize connection in a hierarchy. So perhaps we can start with what we know are wrong relationships, that is, unethical, where, for instance, there is a power difference between two people and we are in the up position. When we are in that up position, it is easy not to notice that the well-being of the other is not being served. We are more in touch with our own emotions and needs than we are with those of others. It's harder work to figure out others. But when we are in the down position in one of those relationships, we sure do know. We still have those basic human longings for having some power over our own destiny, for mattering and belonging. When those are violated, we may rebel. And sometimes human beings turn the tables and then replicate the wrong relationship just with the next person on top. And that creates a cycle of violence and the suppression of the best in people that I think ultimately hurts everyone, even those who think that they are better off in the up position. They have no idea what they have not been able to experience. Wrong relationships, I think we can all recognize. The most obvious is outright oppression. When some use force and power to use others as mere objects without those others having choice, that's oppression. Exploitation is similar, although may not be as total as oppression. Exploitation is when some get more resources at a cost to others. And there's manipulation, where those who are manipulated may have some appearance of autonomy, but they are being misled and often endangered for the selfish advantage of others. I would add simple exclusion from either the concern of other people or a meaningful place in decisions about one's well-being as among the wrong relationships. Now, of course, that tiny baby, like my son I described earlier, cannot have complete choice in decisions about his well-being. He can't have complete autonomy, and his parents are going to make some decisions for him. But if those decisions are made with concern for the baby or not, that makes all the difference in whether it's a right relationship or not. A simple refusal to listen, to hear and understand another, can be a kind of wrong relationship. And the fact is, even when babies don't have verbal skills, there are still ways that we can listen and try to understand their needs and have a right relationship that is out of concern for the other first. Out of our experiences of what is wrong with relationships that aren't working, I think then can come some general ideas of what makes a relationship a right relationship. For much of human history, it was the religions of the world that defined what was right and wrong, sometimes in the name of a deity. Some of those definitions over history were about preserving a hierarchy that work for those who are in the upper part of the hierarchy and not so much for those who are in the lower parts. In the human body with multiple and diverse cells, there is specialization, but not really a hierarchy. We might think of the brain as the driver of the chariot and the arms and legs as horses, but that's imposing a social experience of bad relationship onto what is really happening in the body. The brain also depends on signals from the arms and legs to know what to do. And if the arms and legs don't do what the brain requests of them to do and sends them signals to do, the brain isn't going to achieve its objective. Interdependence of specialized parts is a more accurate description of the human body. And it may be a more accurate description of a human community or society in which there is complexity, but still right relationship. Albert Schweitzer, the philosopher and activist, was motivated by his religious values in his ethical ideas about how to live. For him, ethical living was living in right relationship with all of life, acting always with respect and compassion. Those were his words. Beyond that, the best definition I could find of right relationship that fits with what we tend towards in ethical culture, I found, perhaps ironically, in a document from Catholic Relief Services. This is their quote: "Justice is about the establishment and promotion of right relationships between all members of the human family, as well as the transformation of society's unjust structures and institutions." And of course, I would add that the transformation of such unjust structures and institutions is important, because unjust structures and institutions get in the way of true right relationships. Another quote comes from a totally different field, the field of law. This one comes from somebody named John Humbach. He's a professor at Pace Law School who also taught earlier at Fordham and Brooklyn Law Schools in our neighborhood here. He wrote this in an article called "Towards a Natural Justice of Right Relationship." And remember, he's talking about in the context of making laws. Broadly, right relationships are relations in which each or all seek, without abandoning themselves, to be attentive and responsive to the needs and emotions of one another. You know, when I hear that, I hear a lot of resonance of what makes for an effective cell in a multicellular organism. The Christian scriptures describe loving with all your heart, all your being, all your strength, and all your mind. And in the same verse, love your neighbor as yourself. Loving yourself, or having a right relationship with yourself, is part of right relationship. Now, maybe love is another word for right relationship, though I'm mindful that it has many meanings. Some are narrow and some are broad, and some don't mean the same thing. I'm talking about right relationship. But the best meaning of love, I believe, is similar to that of right relationship. As a feeling, love is about the desire to want another to flourish completely. As action, love is acting in ways that make it more possible for the other to flourish completely while maintaining a commitment to one's own flourishing. So, what did I come up with as some of the characteristics of right relationship? Earlier, I asked those of here in the present meeting to offer some of your ideas, but these are the ones that I came up with, and I think you'll hear a lot of overlap. Number one, respect for the integrity and the worth of the other. As I said when I started, the idea of human worth and the idea of human relationship come together and help make each other. Respect for human worth of every person is the basis for a human connection that we would call ethical. Human worth is itself a relational concept. It is a concept that describes how are we going to treat another person and how are we not going to treat them. Such respect for worth provides for the needs and takes into account the emotions of the other. Understanding that they may be different and will be different from one's own needs and emotions. And here, when I talk about needs, I mean anything that supports a person's thriving. Everything from having enough food, to being supported emotionally, to being able to feel a sense of autonomy and accomplishment, to the sense of belonging. So the second one I picked out was a sense of reciprocity and mutuality. Right relationship is not sacrificing your own self for others. It is fostering the interdependence in ways that by bringing out the best and uniqueness and worth in another, we bring that out in ourselves. In a right relationship, a kind of partnership is essential. Well, but what about that tiny baby? How is caring for an infant a relationship of reciprocity and mutuality? The answer lies in remembering that reciprocity and mutuality don't equate to sameness. In a healthy relationship of an adult carer to the infant, there is a feedback loop, to put it in maybe more mechanistic terms. When those nurses at the hospital reacted to my son in the hospital, who was beginning to make eye contact even when he was less than a day old, I could see the pleasure that it brought to them to have had that contact with him. You know, he probably also got a lot more attention in the nursery than some other infants who weren't ready or able to make that contact yet. It often comes more at a week old. The more we, as parents, interact with our children in ways that foster their well-being, the more we also get from those relationships, even when sometimes that's difficult to relate to. In a right relationship, we include in that choices within the relationship where everyone can participate to their level of capacity to participate. We foster freedom and autonomy of both the other and ourselves. We hear and see the other as a unique person, not simply a reflection of ourselves. And we expect that for ourselves from the other. Mutuality is crucial to a right relationship. Fairness is a word that often comes up in this context, or human rights when we are talking more broadly about right relationships in the wider world. How do you keep freedom and autonomy for some from becoming a hoarding of that freedom and autonomy, a hoarding of resources? John Rawls, a 20th century philosopher on justice, really looked clearly at this over time. And he said it this way. It's a bit dry and in the language of a professional philosopher, but then he is a philosopher. He said, each person is to have an equal right to the most extensive total system of equal basic liberties compatible with a similar system of liberty for all. You know, I call that a we liberty perspective. I contrast it to the kind of me liberty perspective we are seeing far too much of these days. Give me liberty, and I don't care how much it hurts the liberty of others. That's me liberty. Respecting freedom and liberty and autonomy without also being committed in the relationship is to deny freedom and liberty and autonomy to those without the power to seize such power and control others. In other words, the kind of me liberty is what is behind oppression, exploitation, and manipulation. Relationships of oppression, exploitation, and manipulation always sacrifice the well-being of the person in the down position for the people in the up position. And that is very different from those times when we make choices for a child or for an adult who has passed their ability to make competent decisions. Do we make that choice for our own convenience or for the well-being of the other? And so that brings me to the third characteristic that I think is part of all right relationships. Some people begin this one with the idea of do no harm. But I think it goes beyond that to protect from harm and to enhance well-being. A right relationship protects the other person in the relationship from unnecessary suffering. Now, we all know that some suffering in life is inevitable. We are fated, for instance, just by being limited human beings with a short lifespan, and yet with vivid imaginations, to want our right relationships to last forever. And sometimes death and illness and other circumstances get in the way. That suffering of loss, I think, is actually a part of a right relationship. But that suffering can be made worse if we are not supported in our grief and our mourning by our culture and by our other relationships. And of course, none of us perfect. We will all fail sometimes to love our neighbor as much as we love ourselves, or sometimes fail to love ourselves as much as we love our neighbor. And so beyond that, there's a fourth area I would include in right relationship. Even with these limits and the inevitability of mistakes, reliability and trustworthiness are important to right relationship. Just as human worth requires commitment, not just a passing through, so relationship, if it's a right relationship, requires a level of commitment. Even very basic cells have some sort of memory and learning. And so we as human beings, with the specialization possible in our trillions of cells, have a much more sophisticated scheme of memory and learning. We don't live only in the moment. We know what was, and we use our memory of what was and our understanding of that to predict, often with some level of accuracy, what that means about the future. So if we are in a relationship that does harm sometimes, and supports and nourishes at others, if that harm is not repaired in some way, if it's not even acknowledged, that's not a trustworthy relationship. The more often we experience harm and the less often we experience support, the less trust we will have in the relationship being a right one. I already introduced one four-letter word, love, and so I'm going to introduce another that also carries a variety of meanings. This is a word that we use far less often in a culture that so highly values autonomy, often to the point of hurting the many for the benefit of those few with more power. So this other four-letter word is duty. Now, a duty that is imposed on us can be oppression or exploitation or manipulation. But a duty that we choose is one that is compatible with how that we freedom that I talked about, that we freedom that looks to foster freedoms for all, that is compatible with duty. When we take on and fulfill a commitment, we take it on and see it as a duty imposed by our interrelatedness and our values. Another word that we tend not to use in ethical culture is covenant, although I think it's a very useful word too, again with some unfortunate legal and religious history. It means, though, simply coming together. One writer described a covenant as a promise from the heart. It's like the vows people make when they get married. A covenant is the kind of agreement that once we enter into it, we accept a duty to fulfill that commitment so that the others in the relationship can depend on us to live by it. So respect for the integrity and worth of others and ourselves, mutuality and reciprocity, protection from harm, trustworthiness and reliability. Those were what I came up with as the main ingredients. And I think that many of the others that people express tend to fall under one or another of these. So how does our ethical society, or our societies, both individually and in the collective, approach the idea of right relationship? I'd contend that from the start, when that young would-be rabbi Felix Adler spoke in 1876, relationship was as central to our ideas of ethics as was human worth. As I said near the beginning of my talk, human worth itself is a relational concept. For us in the ethical movement, it's about how we relate to one another, not some static quality about a person. Felix Adler's supreme ethical rule was about how we create relationships of respect, mutuality, protection, and reliability. Always act so as to elicit the best, the uniqueness, the worth in others, and thereby elicit your own best, your own distinctiveness, your own worth. Felix Adler often used a metaphor of connectedness. Well, I'd call it a metaphor. I think actually he thought it was more describing reality than a metaphor. He called it the ethical manifold. Now, as the granddaughter of an immigrant who fixed cars in his backyard for a living, and as a one-time math major planning to focus a career in math on topology, I admit that I have some images that always come to mind when I hear the word manifold that are not likely to be what Dr. Adler meant. The dictionary, though, helps with this. Manifold as a noun is a whole that unites or consists of many diverse elements. It is a whole in which the elements do not lose their distinction, even when they are interrelated. I know from reading Adler that he rejected the philosophical idea common in some Eastern faiths that in reality we are all one and not distinguishable. The technical term for that is monism. He thought that was a fake equality and unity because it does not respect diversity and uniqueness, and thus can easily dispose of a human individual. If we are all at root the same, then the universe can do without any one of us without significant change. Adler also rejected the philosophical idea so common in that culture and even today that we are essentially isolated individuals. So that if I work and accumulate great wealth, I can scoff at any inequalities or oppression because every other person could have done the same as I did. I remember being at a forum years ago when someone argued, we could all become president of General Motors. No, we could not, because there is only one president at a time, not 4 to 6 billion presidents. We are interconnected, and so our duty, to paraphrase Adler, is to use what powers we have to provoke power in others, no matter who they are and in all their relations. And in turn, that will create a community, a society, a world in which others use their power to provoke or increase our own. Power does not become a way to enforce a hierarchy where power of one means less power of another. Power that is shared is increased instead for all. That is right relationship seen in the larger context. Adler's vision of the ethical manifold is much like that of the web of jewels. And atoms again. There is an endless net of threads throughout the universe. At every crossing of the thread, there is an individual, and every individual is a crystal bead, and every crystal bead reflects not only the light from every other crystal in the net, but also every other reflection throughout the entire universe. For Adler, we are all interconnected in this web of being. We can't help but be related, so the challenge is to make those relationships into right or ethical relationships. He used the term duty, even knowing that in his day, more than 100 years ago, it was becoming a word associated with dreary requirements, not chosen responsibility. One of his collections of essays or talks even called The Religion of Duty. In the sense of duty I'm using, we still could describe ourselves that way. An ethics-focused religion, not one that centers belief or deities. Religion here meaning a culture and community that organizes meaning and values and sustains our learning and growth into living out those values. Felix Adler's definition of what a religion needed to become was this: what shall we do with this world? What is the outcome to be? We must do what we can to affect the outcome of life. A connection between every person, a mutual connection in an interconnected web of being, and Adler's conception is that the web of being includes not just everyone we encounter, but everyone who lives, and everyone who has ever lived, and everyone who will ever live. This leads to what at first may seem like an odd idea, but I happen to think it is very useful, and it is not unique to ethical societies. Many indigenous cultures, as well as more recent cultures and religions, consider people as having a reciprocal and mutual relationship with our ancestors, both family ancestors and ancestors in a cultural sense. And many also consider us as having a reciprocal and mutual relationship with those who come after us. Adler said of our duty to those who've come before us, let us arise and take up the work they have left unfinished and preserve the treasures they have won. We can widen the circle of their influence even after people have gone. And of our duty to the future, Adler said, the radiant future stretches forth its arms toward us and binds us to be willing servants to its work, willingly to accept the limitations of the individual will, which are indispensable in the service of a far-off cause, a service which at the same time disciplines and ennobles the individual. For Adler, we respect and carry forward that which is good from our ancestors, and I would add, repair any harm they've done that continues to have an effect. And we do what we can to make life good for our descendants, literal and figurative ancestors and descendants. So how is that mutual? We do our best to understand and respect them. And we also learn and grow for ourselves, both through that process of understanding and respect and through our commitment, our taking those relationships seriously. Think, for instance, of the three pieces of music today. Two you've already heard. All are from a different time, and yet each resonates with many today. In a very real way, those authors and singers shape our experience today. And I'm guessing many of you participated by humming or moving or even singing along with the music. Music is one of the most profound ways human beings communicate across the web of being. In thinking of our relationship with those of the past and future, I think also of the words of Christian theologian Reinhold Niebuhr, words that have meant much to me in my life. Nothing that is worth doing can be achieved in our lifetime. Nothing which is true or beautiful or good makes complete sense in any immediate context of history. Nothing we do, however virtuous, can be accomplished alone. No virtuous act is quite as virtuous from the standpoint of our friend or foe as it is from our standpoint. We have a duty to draw on our relationships with the past, with the future, with others in the present, and with those who are different from us. A philosopher in another religious context, Martin Buber, explored a difference which is more apparent in some languages than in English, of treating the other person as a thou, a precious person, not an it or even a depersonalized you. In that relationship of I and thou, we create something between us that he called holy or divine. Perhaps that is what Felix Adler meant by the place where people meet to seek the highest is holy ground. One of Adler's lesser known books he called The Essence of Spirituality. It's all about how to have right relationships with people in our most intimate circles or with those for whom we might be mentors, helping them to be more understanding, or even relationships with oppressors. For Adler, the highest is about seeking and nurturing right relationship. Spirituality, he described in that book as taking your values to the nth degree. So an ethical spirituality is working on especially challenging relationships. In another context, he described spirituality as the consciousness of infinite interconnectedness. It is when we act to be in right relationship that we can experience such a consciousness of that ethical manifold, of that web of all being. And for him, that was the highest realization of purpose and meaning. So how might we draw on these insights of the past and bring them to a future? Among other ways to evolve such insights, I would suggest that we see that the interconnected web of all being includes not just all people of all times and places, but all beings, not putting those other beings above humans or humans above those beings. Some people, like infants or those with limited capacities, even in a mutual relationship, may have more limited capacity to choose consciously. The same is true with other beings in that web of existence, and yet the principles still hold true. A commitment to respect uniqueness and differentiation, a commitment to seeing those relationships as mutual, a protection from harm, a need to build trust and even reliability by consistent, dutiful action. Our lives are not ours alone. We each came here today to be with one another, to share compassion, courage, and hope, maybe even love. We are a part of that web of shining jewels, each with our own light and also reflecting the light of others and ourselves, here and beyond this virtual space, infinitely interconnecting. In that connection, we experience both our uniqueness and our belonging. The me needs you, and both need the we, and the we needs all of our me's and you's. Together, we join our hearts and our beings and our strength and our minds, loving each other and ourselves into a right relationship with life. And I'll say goodbye now to those who are watching this later on video. You can find more about the Riverdale Yonkers Society by visiting rysec.org and more about other ethical societies at aeu.org.